without further ado,
take your time.
hi. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Dungeons and Degrees. My name's Adrian.
And I'm Alex.
And today we have Scott Gray. Did you want to be Scott middle name Gray, or just Scott Gray is fine?
Middle name the first time is usually good because there are a surprising number of people named Scott Gray writing and doing stuff in the world, and it's strange how often it's weird to get confused with them. So
then listen, if you're for SEO reasons, Scott Fitzgerald Gray, okay,
it's
look
a good
that
name.
Up. It is a good name. And we're here with Scott to talk about Core20, and also some of the things that Scott's been working on. And to be honest, before we started recording, just a pleasant fellow to talk to in general. But yeah, tell me about Core20 and why create a new system? What is lacking in the
Why
D&D?
we know what's lacking in the other systems. Why
I know. I know.
We all know.
I know that.
We all know.
Your Honor, you're leading the witness. Core20 is a game. Core20 is basically a version, not the version, but a version of D&D that I've wanted to play my whole life. Is the short answer to that. I started playing D&D a long time ago in high school, 1980. Before both of you were born, I'm pretty sure. I'm guessing correct.
Not too much. Not too much.
Not too much. Okay, that makes me feel slightly better.
Yeah.
And I loved playing D&D. It got me through some rough times in high school, as is the case. There's lots of folks who can tell similar stories. I started working on D&D in 2004. That's the first time I started freelancing as an editor for Wizards of the Coast. So I'm sort of well steeped in the game. And like way back in high school, my first game was AD&D, first edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. My second game was Traveler, which was a game I loved just exactly as much as I loved D&D. And one of the interesting things about the two games is they take a very different approach to character advancement. Right, D&D is the archetypal level and class-based game. You pick one class, you advance in level, everybody goes up level by level. You have there's like a certain baseline of power there. Traveler takes a totally different approach, where you just basically, you start out being good at a certain number of things, and then you decide which other things you want to continue to get better at, right? And I love that approach, and I thought, wow, it would be great for someone to write a version of D&D or to do a game like D&D that does exactly the same thing. So I sat around and waited for someone else to do that because I'm extremely lazy, right? And after, 35 years or whatever it was, I decided, okay, I guess no one else is going to do this. I should probably think about doing it myself. And that was the point at which Core20 sort of sprung into sort of a state of semi-existence.
It's like, nah, fine, nobody get up all at once, you know?
Yeah.
I'll do it myself.
If you want it done right, you got to do it yourself. So maybe that was another angle as well. I don't know. But...
No, that's amazing. I absolutely love that idea. Because like in my own games, I tend to I feel like there's such a halt. Like, I get it. D&D is like the battle sim, whatever, because that's what it mainly does. But like the thing that me and my players, the more interpersonal things and the more I can customize my character, I feel more in tune, and the more RP I can kind of participate within.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, it's D&D has always been a game that focuses on combat as a means of sort of conflict resolution. And older versions of the game, that was a little bit easier. It was a little more palatable because older versions of the game were very much like a war game style setup. You were building a role-playing foundation. You were building up a role-playing game on the foundation of a tactical war game in a lot of cases with the older editions, right? And you can see that very strongly in the rules. D&D, you can do a lot of stuff with D&D, with 5th edition, but even with the earlier editions, with 4th, with 3rd. But even if you want to play D&D as a no, as a non-combat or a low combat game, the problem is that your character is really, really good at combat, even if you don't want them to be. And that's sort of like a fundamental aspect of how D&D works, is everybody gets good at certain things, and you don't have a choice about the things you want to get good at, aside from you can say, I'm going to play a fighter or a barbarian because I want to be especially good at combat, at melee combat, or I can play a wizard or a sorcerer because I want to be especially good at magic, right? But there's this sense that you're good at things even if you don't need to be good at those things when you're playing any kind of class-based game. And that was one of the things that I just thought it would be fun to try to play around with that a little bit and to see if you could come up with a different paradigm for building characters so that you had complete control over everything your character was good at. You could make those decisions right from the ground level, as opposed to just trying to sort of come up with an approximate version of what you wanted your character to be. Like saying, I'm going to pick this class and, oh, here's a subclass that, feels like it does most of what I have in the character concept, and that's as close as I can get. So that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed being the face of a party, but that means if I want to put stuff into charisma, well, then I either have to be some sort of warlock or some sort of rogue or paladin or something like that. I'm stuck to those classes if I want high of those kinds of charisma rolls. Yeah. So there are more what's called Shadowrun kind of has a feel of you're able to customize that part, but you also, because you're that kind of character, right, or you're a runner, so you have to be good at some sort of guns or else you're dead. Yeah. You're dead on arrival. So I've always had I still have to be in combat because I'm still part of this party, or else they're going to be like, Adrian, you're not doing anything. I'm like, I can do the other things really good, okay? I just can't do this.
I think y'all are playing D&D wrong. I'm going to be honest. I think y'all are just playing it wrong. You said, I want a character in which fits most of the things, rather than just fucking all of the dice roll and saying, hey, I'm going to put this and this because of my character. So all I'm saying is, as the resident girl on the podcast, I think y'all are just playing this game wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, that opinion will go over very well on Twitter. I promise you.
Take it. Fight me. Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. So, okay, how am I within Roll or Core20? How am I able to customize? What does that mechanic actually look like?
The way what the mechanic looks like, and this is sort of I'll explain it from the perspective of for people who have already played D&D or played games like D&D, class-based, level-based games, right? If you think about all the things that go into class features, right, whether that's an increase in your attack bonus, or whether that's extra things you can do in combat, like the rogue sneak attack, or whether that's the ability to cast spells and so forth, right? Everything that your character can potentially do is broken out in Core20 into what's called a feat. Now, these are feats more like the 3rd edition feats were, as opposed to the 5th edition feats. 5th edition feats are pretty complicated, and they cover a number of different things because they occupy a very different space in terms of how the game works, right? In 3rd edition, 3.0 and 3.5 alike, feats were basically just class features that were detached from any class. So any class could take a particular feat if they wanted to. There were some restrictions. Some feats were only for certain classes, and some feats it was easier to take if you belonged to a certain class, right? But they were meant to be kind of generic. They were meant to be, you can take this to make yourself better at this one unique thing, to kind of customize your character a little bit more than the stock version would be. So in Core20, the entire game is broken out into different types of feats, right? According to the different categories of things that you can do in the game. Combat is one big one, obviously, and there's a whole bunch of subcategories if you want to play a really strong combat-focused game. Skill use is another one, covering all of the stuff that you do generally when you're not in combat, right? Magic is another one, and there's subsystems for that depending on whether you want to cast arcane magic, like a wizard, cast what in the game is called animus magic, which is the equivalent of clerical magic or divine magic, and then druidos magic, which is what druids cast, right? So when you're starting out building a character, you basically have the opportunity. You say, okay, I've got 20 feats that I can take at as a starting character, right? And I get to decide what my character wants to be good at. And if you're playing a sort of like just a regular game, like a sort of like a standard D&D style game where you're going to be doing a little bit of fighting and a little bit of role playing and a little bit of exploration, you can build characters that are very much like sort of a stock D&D character, right? But even then, you can build them in exactly the way that you want to. And what gets more interesting is that if you don't want to play that particular style of game, you can build a character who can do pretty much anything you want them to do, or to do things in a really, really unusual way, right? An example from just this morning, I've got 2 new campaigns that I'm going to be starting up, and I had one player email me, and their character concept was they wanted to play a monk in quotation marks, druid in quotation marks, because those terms don't exist within Core20, but that's just, talking about them from at the sort of as the archetypes that we're familiar with from D&D. Wanted to play a monk druid who basically specializes in hand-to-hand combat as a bear while they're wild shaped.
That's so good.
That's my dream.
And my first response is, this is going to be fun. You can absolutely do this. I gave him some pointers on look at these feats and look at those feats, right?
Yeah, like those bare feet.
Building a character, because you've got free choice, it can be complicated. But one of the things that the game does is it sets out 3 different ways you can put a character together when you're starting. For people who know the system, who've been playing it for a while, which includes many of my players in my home games, but definitely not all of them, right? You can get to the point where you have a broad enough sense of what's in the rules. You say, okay, I'm going to build a character, and I'm just going completely customized. I'm just going to flip through the book, find the feats that I want, and build something absolutely, right from the ground up custom, right? But there's 2 other approaches to building characters that are right in the first chapter of the book. One is you can play what's called an iconic character. And there are iconic characters in Core20 that look exactly like the iconic or archetypal characters in stock D&D, whether 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, right? You can play a warrior, for example, if you want to play a straight-up martial fighter. You can play an archer. You can play an arcanist if you want to play a wizard or a sorcerer. You can play an animus caster. You can play a druidist caster. You can play a protector, who is kind of like a little bit like a paladin, more like a 3rd edition paladin than a 5th edition paladin. You can play a scout, who's a little bit like a ranger, and on and on and on. So if you're in a hurry, or if you're a brand new player to the game and you just want to start and just sort of see how it feels, you simply look at that section of the book, and it says, if you want to play this type of character, here are the 20 feats you take, and here's exactly what they do. So you're going to take these feats, which are going to give your weapons a boost. You're going to take these feats for defense, take these feats for skills, and so on and so forth. And you've got a character ready to play in about 5 minutes, right? The other thing it does, sort of as a midpoint between that and just, choosing whatever you want and customizing a character completely, is it's got what are called feat packages. And so you can look at the feat packages and you can say, okay, I'm going to take some of this and some of that and some of from column A and column B and column C. Right. So, for example, in the weapon feat packages, you've got one set of feats if you want to be like a frontline combatant, right, with a sort of a heavy weapon. You got another set of feats that you can take if you just want to be like, I want to be good in a fight, but I don't want to be the first person into the fight, right? I want to make sure I'm standing firmly behind, the guy who's got more hit points than I do, right? And you can basically build a character that way, because each of them says, if you take this package, it costs you 5 feats or it costs you 3. And then you just, when you get to 20, you stop. Or you build up, like you take like 16 or 17, and then you've got 3 left over. And then you use those 3 to customize your character even more. Come up with some cool idea for, something that you want specifically to do that isn't part of any kind of standard build.
Are packages, do they cost less, or are they just an assistance to show you, with this package, you can this is what it's going to cover?
It's just an assistance. It's just basically for sort of organizing them in sort of easy to assemble ways, right? Like you're building a character piecemeal, effectively, right? And you're tapping into you can get a sense looking at the feat packages of what you want your character to do, because they lay it out pretty clearly. This is for someone who wants to be front and center in combat. as opposed to this is for someone who wants to fall back in combat. This is for someone who wants to fight with lighter weapons and use dexterity as opposed to using strength, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Just wanted to kind of see if I was visualizing the same things as you were speaking of. When creating this, how long has it taken you to get to where you're like? When did you start? I guess that's the easier question.
A long time ago. The first version of the game started off just as basically house rules to D&D 3.5, and we started playing with those house rules back in 2010, and this was just for my own home game at the time, right? And the idea was that I'd always had this idea of this would be a fun thing to try out at some point. Too bad I'm too busy to worry about it, right?
Yeah.
And we were playing a 3.5 campaign. This was into the 4th edition era, but we had a 3.5 play-by-post campaign, a forum campaign that we were running at the time with some friends of mine who are far-flung. We don't live in the same geographic area anymore. But these are two friends that I was gaming with in high school, right? Going way back. So we were having a great time on there, and we were playing just, sort of stock 3.5, and it was like any forum game. It was lots of great narrative and lots of great storytelling going on. And I had one player, friend of mine, name of Dave, who's been front and center throughout this entire Core20 playtest process, right from the very beginning. And he was playing a Ranger, and none of the Ranger builds quite worked for him. The 3.5 Ranger was a little bit too woodsy for him, so I pointed him towards, there was a really excellent urban Ranger from a book I had worked on a few years before that. One of the Thieves World? Yeah, one of the Thieves World books that Green Ronin had put out. Robert Schwalb, I think, was the lead on those. I used to work with him quite a bit back in those days.
Green Ronin, is that Chris Pramus?
Yes, Chris Pramus's. Yeah, Chris. Chris and Nicole Lindrus run Green Ronin. They've done lots of cool stuff with lots of different IPs. Thieves World was one that they did back in the day for 3.5. And they had an urban Ranger in one of those books. So it was basically the Ranger, but it was more slanted towards sort of like city stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And that kind of got him he liked that one better. But there were still a couple of things where he was looking at it going, this one feature that I'm going to get at 5th level, I can't see myself using it. It doesn't really fit the idiom, right? We used to talk about the character's idiom quite a bit. And so I said to him, I remember very distinctly, I said, I've got this idea for, swapping stuff out. Give me some time to think about this. And I might come up with a system where we can sort of break out, all the class features and figure out a different feature that would sort of be, roughly the same value and that sort of thing. And that was really the starting point. The concept for the game kind of just fell out of my head at that point. And I started making notes on it. And we started playing it just as a set of house rule adjustments to 3.5. It was literally just like the first version of the game, version 0 is what I call it now, was just a collection of notes saying, okay, instead of, if you're playing this class, then instead of your class features, I've taken all the class features and I've turned them into feats. So you can decide which of these feats you want to take, right? And I did that for all the standard classes, all the core classes in 3.5, right? And that's how we started playing. And then just made all sorts of different mechanical advancements after that, and a lot of fine tuning and clarifying things and making a lot of things simpler, because the original concept, like a lot of designers, I love things to be really complicated first, and then I play with them for a while and I think, what was I thinking? And so they get simplified after that. But one of the first things that I came up with was the idea of how feat selection would work sort of over the long term. Because breaking everything down into its constituent parts is easy, right? But then you run into the problem of somebody who says, okay, I'm just going to take weapon focus is the feat that gives you a bonus on your attack rolls with specific types of weapons, just as one example. And you get somebody who says, okay, I'm going to take weapon focus 10 times, right? In the first 6 months of the game kind of thing, and suddenly you're more powerful than you need to be. So the framework that I set up for the game is the idea that certain feats are more inexpensive to take when you first take them, and then they get more expensive as you go later on, right? So weapon focus, for example, the first 3 times you take it, it costs you what's called a feat slot. A feat slot is your potential to take a feat, right? You earn 1 feat slot, and you gain 1 feat slot, sort of like in lieu of experience as you're adventuring. That's what you get to progress your character. But when you want to take weapon focus for the fourth time, it costs you 2 feat slots. So you have to invest more in it, and your advancement slows down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked that system when I first came up with it, because I liked the idea of a system that felt like it reflected, like in real life, it takes a lot of work to get good at something, right? But you can get good at something, reasonably quickly if you're dedicated. Getting really good at something takes much longer, right? Because building on your initial, your initial talent and your initial skill, you have to push a little bit more to get to the next stage. And becoming the absolute best at something takes way, way long. And for a lot of people, is just impossible, right? And that's effectively how the feat structure in Core20 is set up. It's very easy to get good at things, but then at some point it gets more difficult to become really good, and then even more difficult to become great at things. And so there's this sense of the game has sort of like a built-in speed to its sense of progression, whereas where if you're running a campaign for a long time, if you're running a character for a long time, you get to decide whether you want to continue to dedicate yourself to the one thing that you're already good at, or whether you want to sort of spread out a little bit so that you can get good at other things as well.
No, I really enjoy that, because I agree that like it sounds like you're really preventing the like gamer boys from taking like being really good at one thing, and then that sort of loses that authenticity of building a character and like really getting to enmesh yourself with this entity that you are creating in your head. And like, but really values that like real life lived experience of doing things. Like that sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I mean, Core20 definitely isn't a quote unquote realistic game, any more than any other fantasy game can be realistic. But there's a sense of verisimilitude to it that, to me, I personally like. And that's one of the key things that I was thinking about all the time that I've been working on the game, is the idea that with the development of 3rd edition D&D, and even much more so into 4th edition, but then back into 5th edition, sort of at about the same level as 3rd edition, D&D has kind of become a superhero fantasy game beyond a certain level, right? And it's an interesting phenomenon for me, because people who are old enough to have played AD&D back in the day, right? There was no obligation or expectation for the most part that you would have to go up to a particular level, right? And most AD&D campaigns, if you talk to people who played them, generally went up to like 9th level, 10th level, maybe 12th or 13th. And that at some point became a natural place where you would just want to stop, right? You would get up to that point, you'd be very successful heroically, you'd accomplish a lot of goals, you'd make a lot of money, and then you'd realize, I've done what I wanted to do as a character, and it's time for me to move on to something else, right? And 3rd edition changed that with the setup of 20 levels, with the expectation that you were supposed to play to 20th level. And that's something that 5th edition has adopted. And I've got no issue with high level play. I got no issue with people who love high level play. I've personally written a lot of stuff for high level play, especially in the 4th edition days, right? But for me and for a lot of people, D&D traditionally has a kind of a sweet spot between about 3rd level and 9th or 10th level. When you look at statistics, if you talk to people or you look at polls and surveys and such, a lot of people talk about how they only play 5e up to about 9th or 10th level, sometimes even less than that. Because for them, that's sort of where the story is the most interesting. And for me, that's definitely where the story is the most interesting, because that's where the story, you can get into sort of like wild, over-the-top, world-shaking events, but your characters are still very firmly grounded in the idea of they are living people living in this world, and they feel like they're a part of it, as opposed to feeling like they're somehow above it, like they've been elevated above it by this state of being a superhero. And so one of the things about Core20, like you talked about, there's a bit of a disincentive to try to power game your way into sort of absolute power in any one particular thing. And what that does is it sets up a really interesting kind of a process where when you're building a character, instead of advancing your character vertically, you tend to start advancing your character horizontally. So you decide, like instead of spending 3 feat slots to get weapon focus times 7, for example, like the 7th time I'm going to take weapon focus, right? I can do something else instead, which will make me better in combat in a different way. If playing a combat focused character is kind of what you want to do, right? You can dabble in things that you might not have the chance to do otherwise if you're playing a game that kind of rewards or expects that your character has to be the best they can be at every single next phase, right?
Yeah, there's like this expectancy past level like 10, like you guys are gods, now you gotta go fight over here. But like that mortality between 3 and 9 of like, you're getting better, but that's because you're heading to this like big guy who's still within this kind of realm. You know, I understand that, like, it's almost like godhood at level 20, and it's like, I've ascended.
Yeah, I mean, fourth edition did that explicitly because it went to level by going to level 30, right? The idea, like, once you were past level 20, you were actually effectively demigods. You were the most powerful, entities in the world at that point, right? And you were fighting gods directly. And like I said, I don't have a problem with that style of play. Not knocking people who like it. I wrote some stuff for, like, you know, for the epic tier of 4th edition that I really enjoyed writing and working on, and I know people have had fun playing it. But for me, just as a player and as a GM, the style of game I've always enjoyed is one where it feels like there's the William Faulkner, in his Nobel acceptance speech prize, used the phrase talking about fiction. He talked about fiction as being, I can't remember the exact wording, but he talked about fiction being rooted in the idea of the human heart in conflict with itself, right? And that's something that's always appealed to me for gaming as well. If you just sort of, you tweak that a little bit and you can talk about the humanoid heart in conflict with itself. You know, the idea that characters, when the game is most compelling and when the adventures are most compelling, the characters have real personal stakes. And for me, that's kind of the sweet spot where I always really wanted Core 20 to sit, and where the game really, really does well.
How are you working with playtesting? Where are you at currently within creating Core 20?
Yeah, Core 20 right now is in an open playtest, basically. The game is we've been playing the game and working on the game for, like I said, since 2010, and just going through a process of just playing it just to have a good time, right? I had many people who've played it, many people who've seen it have said, like, 10 years ago now, in some cases, you should really do something with this. And I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever, right? A lot of it was just sort of like, not having the time, not really being sure that anyone would be that interested in the system. But also a sense of just sort of wanting it to cover all the stuff I wanted it to cover, and wanting it to sort of fix all of the things about D&D that I think should be fixed. And that sort of became the process of the last little while. So we've got the game previously went through 6 different versions of what we can call like alpha playtesting, which was just being playtested by me and my own home groups and some other people who were interested in it, right? And so version 7, which is the playtest version 1, is what's out now. And that's basically the entirety of the player and GM facing rules of the game. There's nothing missing. It's not like a preview or a sample, or it does some of it. In some ways, it's actually honestly more than the full game, because part of what I'm hoping to get out of the playtest is a sense from people of saying, this is really cool, but it probably doesn't need to be part of the core rules. It might be better as a supplement. There's lots of combat options that might at some point be better in like a book of advanced combat stuff, right? But the game right now is pretty much fully playable. The playtest, you can go to the development blog for the game is at core20rpg.com, and you can go there and click on the playtest button at the top, and it'll take you to a page where you can download all the stuff. So there's 2 main books. There's the player's guide, and there's what's called the magic grimoire, because they split out spells and magic items into their own book rather than trying to shoehorn everything into a player's book that it's going to inevitably be way bigger than you want it to be.
Yeah.
Right? There's a monster package, like 180, I think, monsters in like a playtest monster compendium, which at some point there'll be a bigger monster book, but it's a very good, wide range of foes and allies and things you can play around with. There's a little bit of GM guidelines, but not a full GM's guide or like a full campaign guide. Just for the simple reason that at some point when that book exists, I don't think I want to be the one to write it. I'd rather that be a book that I get a bunch of different contributors to talk to add stuff to get lots of different viewpoints on how one should, run a campaign, how one should build a campaign. So that's sort of a future thing. But the game right now is in a very playable playtest state. And it's for anybody who wants to play it, it's there and it's free and you can have at it.
I'll put it in the description, or under the guest socials. It'll be right there.
Sure.
I also think it's interesting and this is the first time I've ever thought about having like a set of like core rules or like character building. But I mean, does it have to have a GM guide attached to it? Could it just be like, here's some ways to build your character and like maybe eventually down the road? Because what it sounds like, and this is why you're on the podcast, that like that part just needs to go. Like you just need to full send it, right? Get it up, get some money coming your way for this good knowledge and resources that you're like giving out. Because we all get rich playing this game, and we all get rich playing RPGs, but
in feelings.
In feelings. But that's the conflict, right? In the body and the heart is that like I need money to continue to live and survive, but my heart says I want to do something else. So what we're saying is that the capitalism is just the worst of it all for everybody.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, I absolutely hear you. At some point, the next stage in the plan is I want to actually bring the game to market, and do. I mean, it needs a little bit more editing. I mean, I've written and edited the game up to this point, and everyone who writes and who edits their own stuff knows that at some point you also get someone else to edit it because they will find stuff that you've missed many times. Definitely want to get some more consulting on it. One of the things that I'm happy about with this current draft is that I was able to work with a number of consultants to try to make the game sort of the best version of quote unquote D&D that it can be, because it is like, if you've ever played any version of D&D and you play Core20, you'll know exactly how this game feels, right? It's built around the D20 system because I like personally the D20 system. I know there are lots of other great games, but the D20 system does what I need it to do. Core20 does a lot to fix some of the problems with the D20 system, and I'm pretty happy with that. But it also does things like it's got like there's a kind of an anti-colonialist mindset baked into the game and its world. The setup of the sort of the core lineages of the game reflects that. The setup of the game pays a certain amount of attention to inclusion and disability, right? And I worked with some amazing people to talk about just sort of like general issues of disability, not just in terms of the game, but also the language of the rules and things that the language of the rules should do and not do. Some of those were things I had never thought about. I've been working on the game. I've been working on D&D for 20 years up to that point, right? And to have pointed out to you, you should avoid using the word normal in a game, because the word normal means something very different to a person who's able-bodied than it does to a person who has a disability. And it's just in the usage of like, your normal form or your normal statistics, that sort of thing, right? And just making that one tiny change of just instead of saying normal, you switch to usual or typical, right? And it changes the feel of what you're talking about. It changes the feel of how the game potentially comes across to people. That was part of the reason that the game took as long to kind of come to this stage as it did, was because I was always cognizant of wanting to fix some of those things, and like if I put a version of the game out 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, I'm quite confident that I would right now be putting out a revised version of the game that fixes all the stuff I didn't fix the first time. And so part of me is glad that I waited to this point, because the game right now is really sort of the best expression of itself, I think. It's really the game that I wanted to put out.
How did you find those individuals that kind of assisted you in, changing the language and things like that? Were they already inside your circle? Did they reach out to you? How
No,
did that come about?
yeah, no, I definitely reached out to them. I can mention a couple of them because I don't think they would object to being mentioned. James Mendez was one who did some wonderful consulting on the lineages section. This was quite a while ago, and the section's changed a bit since then. So anything still wrong with the section, totally my fault, not on James, because there has been some new stuff done since then. But I found he came to my attention with he did an amazing series of blog posts talking about the problems of racism that are inherent in sort of stock D&D. And the problem specifically with the half-orc character. I don't have the link handy, and I can't remember the exact title of it, but I could probably, at the end of things, I can throw that your way if anybody's interested in reading it. It's a wonderful read. And I know that James has done consulting. He's done consulting for Wizards of the Coast on at least a couple of things, I know. He consulted on the 2024 books. He just mentioned that on Twitter not long ago. So he's one person I reached out to. Another person I reached out to who I knew her just as a designer because we had worked on a book for Wizards of the Coast together. Her name is Jennifer Kretschmer, and she is a disability consultant. She's a writer. She's an actor. She does a whole bunch of stuff. So she gave me some invaluable feedback on things. And then she was also in a position where she said, for these certain things, you should talk to people who know more than I do about this. So I talked to a wonderful person named Rogan Shannon, who is a deaf consultant, because I wanted to do some cool stuff with sign languages in the game. So he gave me some invaluable feedback on what was working and what wasn't. The stuff that I just kind of made up off the top of my head saying, okay, I think this sounds right. And he was like, yeah, this does sound right. The rest of it, no. So here's some suggestions for fixing it, right?
Yeah.
So but there are people out there, and the people who are out there who can do this kind of work, most of them know each other. They're not hard to find. And it's an invaluable feedback and guidance, talking to people who know more about certain parts of what you're doing than you actually know.
Yeah, that's very good points of view for those that are starting to create things to just get some outside information. I know that we've also in our past episode with when suddenly talked about like making sure things are I guess, well, it was talking about I don't know, Alex, can you help me out here? We're talking about like certain creatures that shouldn't be in the book, like just reaching out to others.
Oh, yeah, reaching out. So we discussed talking about different, like, even cryptids or like creatures or animals that are based in very sacred traditions within different cultures around the world. So,
Yes.
Making sure that you're not taking those creatures and then bastardizing them, like making them and keeping them in the high regards of the way that they're treated. So like, we can absolutely have 1,000 different versions of Mothman because Mothman is the silliest and we all love Mothman, but like maybe we're not talking about other, I don't want to say names because I like, you know what I mean? Like the cryptids that we don't talk about, like taking that.
If you go back to that episode, okay, but after you finish this episode, you'll know what we're talking about because I stepped in it and egg was on my face.
Oh
okay?
my gosh. I do have a video of my
experience.
kids singing it in class, so there's at least that moment too that I have kids singing.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that a lot of designers struggle with is the roots of the game, the roots of D&D in a very, very colonialist mindset, right? And as someone, I mean, you can see me on camera here. You can tell I'm extremely white.
What?
I'm a white Canadian.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know.
Whoa.
Like many people who look like me, I grew up steeped in a sense of colonialism as being what was usual, what was typical, right? Colonialism was just the way the world worked, right? And it's not until you really sort of spend some time thinking about what the game is actually saying, right? What baseline D&D has always kind of said in terms of what the mode of the game is and what the point of the game is, right? You're coming into this wild, untamed frontier, which is somehow, actually settled by people already. It's not empty, right? But your job is to go in and effectively take their stuff, right? And when you're 12 years old and you're just playing a game, it's not a huge deal. But as the game has gotten bigger, as the game has gotten more important, as a sort of like a part of the social zeitgeist, right? These things, the raw edges of the game have become a lot rawer, right? And those are things that I, as a designer and as an editor, I'm quite keen on sort of trying to sand those off a little bit and get them fixed whenever it's possible to do so. So again, those were all ideas that I had in mind when I was working on Core20. And just wanting to sort of make sure that as much as I could sort of fix what needed to be fixed. And I'm sure there's lots more stuff that needs to be fixed, and I'll look forward to doing that between now and when the game officially comes out for real. But
which is in the next 6 months, right? Because we're gonna push it. We're gonna send it.
Just gonna really mainline this and nothing else.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, and it would be great to do something with it early in 2025 for sure. That's sort of the plan right now. And between now and then, looking to get as much feedback on the game and hear from as many people who are interested in trying it out as humanly possible. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes.
I know we're not even there yet, but do you have any visions for the future of Core20, other kind of feat bundles that you're looking at?
Honestly, yeah. There's one thing that absolutely never made its way into the core 20 rules right now, which is the idea of what in third edition were called prestige classes. But the idea of what I think in the game would be called something like, not prestige because it's the wrong word, but like a prestige path. Right, so the number of feats that are in the book it's a huge number of feats, it's a huge number of options, but there's always room for something that's a little bit more specialized. And so I can imagine the idea of, okay, you want to play a character who's from one particular magical order, one group of sorcerers, right? And they have specific traditions that only they know. So here's a little supplement that details what that order is, and here are the 5 feats that aren't in the core rules that you can only take if you learn them from someone in this sorceress order. So that kind of, sort of like the next level of specialization. And certainly there may be stuff in the rules right now that would be better broken out to be something like that. That's one of the things I'm hoping to get feedback on when people are having a look at stuff. Anything that, that you look at and you think this is really nice, but it feels like maybe it should be something sort of a little bit distinct or a little bit separate, or not be something that anyone in the world can just sort of tap into if they want to.
Right.
Aside from that, I really don't know. I mean, I'd like the game to be something that other people can work with. I mean, my existence in this industry owes itself 100% to the Open Gaming License, the OGL.
Yeah.
Right. In very real terms, I played first edition AD&D, as I'd said, and I got out of gaming for quite a while. At the end of the first edition era, my main group, we'd been friends for years, we all sort of ran out of time to game, right? The idea of kind of at that point, I tried to get a game going with a bunch of strangers didn't really appeal to me. So it just became something that slipped away. And then after that was work, and after that was kids and that sort of thing. And there was literally a day sometime in 2000, I think it was the fall probably. And I was sitting at home working, and the thought just popped into my head, whatever happened to Dungeons and Dragons? Because I literally had no idea at that point. I hadn't been into a hobby store for years. I hadn't been into a comic shop for years, right? And so I looked it up online. I was going to say I Googled it, but I probably Alta Vista'd it at that point in time. And heard that the third edition of the game had just come out, because I think it was released in August, September, kind of October at that point in time, right? Gen Con 2000, I think, was when the Player's Handbook dropped, if I remember correctly, the 3.0 Player's Handbook. And the articles that I was reading talked about the Open Gaming License and the idea that anybody could do anything they wanted to with D&D at this point in time. You could do your own stuff, you could write your own stories, you could let your imagination run wild, but still have it connected to the real game, the actual game. And it blew my mind in much the same way that the game itself blew my mind the first time I ever played it. Right? There was this awareness of something has changed in my life. And so that's what got me back into D&D, and that's what got me, from there getting back into working freelancing for Wizards of the Coast and for other companies as well. So I'm here because of the OGL. And I would love to have a game out there that other people can do the same things with. Just basically look at it and say, we're going to do our own supplements, we're going to do our own adventures, we're going to do our own. You can't do class design, because there are no classes, but certainly you could do this idea of, we're going to do like a prestige path or a specialist path, that's going to tie to this one little bit of narrative, this one group in the world that I'm going to write up their story, right? And this is how that story translates into mechanical terms. This is what you can do with your character to make them part of that story. I would love to see that happen. That's definitely a goal.
Awesome. Yeah. As someone who's worked within the freelance part of TTRPGs, what is some advice you can give to those who are trying to get into that space?
My advice for getting into the space, I think, is kind of questionable because the space has changed a lot since the way that it was when I started out, right?
Right.
But I think the baseline rules are probably all still the same. One is, make sure that you're involved with people who are doing the kinds of work that you would like to do, right? And this doesn't mean that you have to, spend a lot of money to go to conventions to try to meet people, because that's one kind of tired bit of advice that seems to go around. Like people say, oh, you won't get work if you don't go to conventions. I rarely go to conventions, and I am arguably the most employed editor working in RPGs right now. Right. Nice. I've never, I don't say that with any sense of bragging. I absolutely understand how fortunate I am and how lucky I've been to work on some of the books that I've worked on and to work with some of the people that I get to work with on a daily basis. But, I never went to a convention with the express intent of I've got to meet this guy or I've got to meet this person because they're the one who are going to hire me for this job because they're the freelance manager, such and such. You can get your name out there in different ways, right? The best piece of advice, and this is not my advice, lots of other people have said it, think of yourself as being part of the community, right? Of like a community of like-minded creatives. I probably heard this from someone on your show previously, honestly, because it's ringing a bell. It's ringing a bell at this point, honestly. Just sort of like I'm hearing that, and then I'm hearing your voices often. I'm thinking, yeah, okay, I'm probably stealing this from someone who was a previous guest on your show. But like, it's not.
People need to hear it multiple times.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, you just
get it into their heads.
Yeah, RPGs really are a community. That's the thing that separates them from so many other different types of creative expression, right? You can write a novel by yourself. You can write a screenplay by yourself. You can practice music by yourself. It's very difficult to get anywhere in RPGs if your goal is I'm just going to sit by myself and write this stuff. And even though I'll get better when I write it, I don't want to engage with other people, right? I'm not going to, ask people if they want to playtest stuff. I don't want to be involved with, people getting together to put a book out. I'd rather just do my own stuff. If that's sort of where you are, then work past that. Figure out a way to work past it. You're right. I'm the world's worst introvert. I know how difficult it is to, reach out to people and introduce yourself and say, hey, I really like what you're doing. Can I, do you have any room for me to be a part of what you're doing? Or I'm also doing something similar. Would you like to be a part of what I'm doing? Right. Don't worry too much about being rejected. Right. If somebody says no, I'm actually too busy with my own stuff to work on your stuff, but that looks really cool. Take that as focus on the last half of that. Focus on them saying, yeah, what you're doing looks interesting. Right. It's just not something that they can do at that particular point in time. And just try to engage with what's going on in the space around you as much as you possibly can, because that's how things will start coming back to you eventually. That's been my experience.
I think it was interesting.
Had that guest on, whoever that was, thank you. Thanks. We've had so many guests.
No, I think it's really interesting because we're right off of that Gen Con high. I don't know if it's a high anymore because I am so tired. And I have yet to recover.
I'm almost not sick.
I have yet to unpack. That's just sitting. All the games are just sitting in a bag downstairs. I have I've just looked at them. But I can say, like, going to those things and saying, I'm going to network, leaves people who are looking for, like, genuine human connections, which is what all of these games are based off of, like, with a really icky taste. So, like, I personally did not enjoy the interactions of people who were like, oh, who else can I talk to in this room? Who else can I go introduce myself to? What business card do I need to get in order to get myself a little more forward? But where I absolutely enjoyed it were the times when we were having real conversations about real people things, and we were talking about our families, we were talking about the things that we love, we were talking about why we love role-playing games so much, and from that, those connections are so much easier to ask, right? Can you help me out with my project because I care about you? And like that melding, especially in this space, like that has to be there. I guess it doesn't have to be there. You know what? I'm just giving out advice because I think it's good. I mean,
I think it absolutely is there for every work. Certainly every work that I'm familiar with in the RPG space that matters. What you just described, that's been at the heart of it. That's been at the core of it. And you can contrast that with, and I'm definitely not going to mention any names, certain projects and certain people who it's very clear that what they're mostly about is themselves when they're in the space, right? And the products that they make just don't hit, they don't land properly because there's something missing there. And I think what's missing is exactly what you just said, that sense of belonging, that sense of being part of a community.
Yeah, and I think taking Core20 out of 3rd edition and saying, what is the purpose of this game if we're not playing war? What else can I do with this space if I don't have to focus on colonizing and murdering entire villages and pillaging whenever I get the chance? What else can you do? I was just looking at I know y'all saw me on my phone. I was not messaging or bothering other people. I was like looking at the actual rule book or what you have posted so far, and it looks incredible. And like for me, it makes sense. Everything that you've said translates almost perfectly in this rule book. And once again, I'm going to push you that this needs to come out. Like this needs to be monetized at this point. It looks so good and it sounds good.
Thank you.
And even reading it, like it makes sense. Like I want to play this versus, having to go on whatever D&D Beyond and building a character. Like I like that customization. That's fun for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, talking about customization and talking about like not wanting to play a combat game, and to be absolutely fair, you can for anybody who likes who likes to play a combat heavy game, because there are many monsters who are worthy of fighting, and you can certainly set up a monster hunting campaign that doesn't have colonial overtones if one wants to, right? But the game has a sense that, I mean, you can literally decide as a group, right, GM and players, whether how much of each of those the three pillars, as D&D refers to them, what I refer to in the rules as the three sides of a game. Because I've never liked the pillar analogy, because it always seemed pretty obvious to me that if you have three pillars and the pillars are different sizes, your roof just falls down.
Mm-hmm.
So any D&D's combat pillar is always the biggest one, and just things are going to teeter, right? And I think that's one of the things that happens with 5e a lot. But you can decide to focus on whatever part of the game you want to focus on. One example, like if you decide you simply don't want to run a combat game, you simply set the game up and you say nobody takes any combat feats, and that's it. That's the only thing you need to do. I actually ran a really nice sort of like a test bed campaign for that. There's a part of the game which is called combat maneuvers, which is the idea of having things that you can do if you're in a fight that don't just resolve down to just beating other people into submission, right? So things like, grappling is part of that, tripping, distracting foes in combat, right? So that they get dazed and you've got a chance to run away from them or what have you, right? And I wanted to run a campaign to test that. So I said, okay, we're going to do a short urban campaign. And I said, nobody takes anything more than weapon focus 1. You can get a +1 to attacks with your weapon if you really want to use a weapon, but you don't have to use a weapon. Come up with other ideas, right? And I made it clear to people, this is not going to be a combat-free campaign. There will be people who are chasing you, and there will be fights that you get involved in against your will, but you're not going to be able to fight your way out of those fights. You have to come up with things that you can do otherwise, right? And it was an amazing experience because I had the coolest character concepts. One player played a sewer worker who moonlighted as a professional wrestler, right? So she was heavily into grappling. Awesome. So when a fight broke out, she would just basically grapple people, tie them up, and then sprint off. Right. I had one player who just, one player who just focused, who focused just on low level illusion magic, right? So that if something happened, they were just distracting enemies, right, in order to kind of like sow chaos on the battlefield, right, and just and to get out of the way, and just lots of cool concepts like that. If you want to play a low magic campaign, which is another thing that lots of folks are interested in, right? You can simply say, okay, nobody takes any feats past the 3rd level of spell casting. So you can't get anything more than 3rd level spells, which are the equivalent of 2nd level spells in 5e, because spells are broken out a little bit more in Core20, right? And doing that doesn't break the game in any other way. You can make any part of the game kind of modular that way. Because if you can't take one thing, it simply means you've got other options. You just have to focus on the other things that you can do, right? And you're not in a position of saying, okay, let's play a low magic campaign, and I guess that means nobody's going to be able to play a wizard, right? Or once your wizard goes to 3rd level, you're going to have to multi-class into something else, right? Because the rules bend a little bit when you start to sort of force them that way.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not like a one set path. You can start to divulge into other things that might be necessary.
I did have my brain think about, it's a 3-sided game, but like we're just getting people to play this game and then like getting them into some sort of pyramid scheme. Like, that's how we...
Don't look at the pyramid too closely, but like it's 3 sides.
That's what it is. Okay, hold please.
But
RPGs are pyramid schemes, because if I get in and I bring 3 friends, then they want to play. And
if I'm not available, they want somebody else, so they get somebody else to GM. Yeah. It's like it's a whole thing.
In the most amazing way, you've just described the fall of TSR back in the 80s. Seriously, because that was the big problem. Your podcast is wonderful. Don't want anyone to tune out now, but there's a great little podcast for people who are interested in the history of D&D. There's a great podcast that I just finished listening to called When We Were Wizards. And it's like an oral history of the Gary Gygax days of early D&D up to the point when Gygax left the company. And it takes a very dim view of Gygax. It makes him look, I think, like the person he actually was, which was quite a bit self-serving and not a nice person for the most part, especially to people who he had a grudge against. But it's a great thing. But
yeah.
If you've read any of the books talking about that period, the whole thing with D&D was they had for like a period of 3 years this incredibly exponential growth, right, where they just kept selling through basic sets, right, and basic versions of the rules. They kept selling through AD&D books. And then suddenly it just stopped precipitously. And there were certainly other things going on that contributed to that, right? The Satanic Panic was one thing, right? But the big problem when you crunch the sales data, when you look at the numbers, seems to be that was the model they were going on, right? You'd have one person with a basic set. They'd play the game with 5 friends. 2 of those friends would say, oh, this is great. I want to run games too. And then they'd go out and buy 2 more basic sets. And then they'd get 5 friends each. And 2 of those would say, oh, game is great. I want to run this game. And at some point, TSR simply got to the point where they had sold the game to everyone who was potentially interested in buying the game, right? They got through that entire market, right? The pyramid scheme went as far wide as it could, and then just kind of collapsed after that. It's a remarkably apt analogy, I think.
I mean, that's just how it went. Like, I remember in college where, like, Listen, you can borrow my books, and then eventually, like, I don't need to borrow your books. I'm just gonna buy my own books. Like, that's just how it started. Like,
Yeah.
people started getting all
When
that other stuff.
when we started playing, when my friends and I started playing, this is a legitimately true story. The books in Canada were even more money than they were in the States. Like in terms of the amount of money they were probably like $30 each. But in 1981, that was a substantial. 1980, 81. It was a not insubstantial amount of money. And the other thing was, I grew up in a small town of 2,000 people in middle of nowhere, Western Canada. Right. In order to go to a game store, I had to drive 5.5 hours to Vancouver because there were literally no game stores. At some point, we got a game store an hour away from us, like in 12th grade. So that was a huge thing. And then at some point, we actually got a game store in our town, which was just like the greatest thing that had ever happened. But when we started playing, I had one friend who owned the Player's Handbook. I had one friend who bought the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I bought the Monster Manual because none of us could afford to own all three books.
Yeah.
And we just literally, like you said, we just swapped them around, right? As
Yeah.
we were building campaigns and building characters, we would just, we would get together whenever we could because it was the only way to get all three books in one place at the same time.
The Triforce.
Yeah.
They were too powerful altogether, but separated. The power can be contained in Western Canada.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, Alex, we've hit the hour mark.
I know, I'm so
Any last question?
sad.
I know. It felt like it just whizzed by. Also, this freaking fly is annoying the hell out of me. I can't wait to turn off the mic and or turn off the cameras and just figure out how to either flush it out or just get rid of it. I don't know. Okay, you're good? You're good?
I'm doing great.
Okay. Any last questions, Alex?
Oh my gosh, can you just adopt us, please, Scott? Can we just? I really feel like
I've had
you're
a lot
doing
of
the
American
best.
friends who've asked that question over the last 6 years or so.
Rightfully so,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm
I
hoping
found our
I'm hoping
cult
that's going
leader.
to take a turn for the better.
Our TTRPG commune cult leader,
There you
yes.
go.
Yes.
Yeah. If you can just call me from the Saskatchewan border, I'll pick you up. It'll be fine.
Oh my gosh. We could go
Yeah,
to Canada.
everybody
How
else
much safer
hear
would that be? We're going to Canada to start our commune. Scott is our cult leader.
Yeah.
And all hail Scott. I'm done. I'm
I
sold.
could
Easy.
get used to that, which is probably a bad sign.
Yeah. It feels really good, but in a bad way.
As long as you just don't like let it go to your head and just like start growing out your hair and just like in the smallest little like.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the sign that it's just full mane, the power.
Adrian and I were talking before we started recording about how, like I'm happy to not be someone who has like 10,000 followers on Twitter because I think it would break my brain. I don't know. I think the cult leader thing would be similar. It would just be a little bit too much to try to deal with.
I know my destiny in this life now, so I apologize.
If we go radio silent, we're in Canada.
My roots are somewhere in Canada. Oh, my roots! Get out! Sorry.
Scott, where can they find you?
People can find, well, if you're in Canada, just sort of cross the border, left, right, drive 5 hours, and then I'm the house on the left. If you're not, you can find me on most socials as Scott F. Gray. So I'm still on TwitX, trying to, manning the ramparts. Also on Blue Sky, also on Dice Camp on Mastodon. So you can track me down at any of those fine locations. Core20, as I said, the main website is the development blog, which is at core20rpg.com. I also have a website for general stuff, which is insaneangel.com, which is not updated nearly as often as it should be, but there's occasional things there to look at.
Oh my god, I'm obsessed. So, everybody go bombard Scott on all medias. We'll create a cult shrine. We'll all find all of the D&D books that you've edited And that's how we'll start. And then you'll have a throne. We'll create a throne. I love this.
You need a lot of books for that, but yeah.
I mean,
There's enough nerds out there.
there's
to make
so
one,
many
you
books
know?
behind you right now, though. Like, we could just use those, like the personal
Yeah.
collection.
Yeah. It's extensive. You have to get a bigger
Well-
office at some point to accommodate them all. But
Yep.
Thank you, dear listener, for joining us on another episode of Dungeons and Degrees. You can find us on all social media sites at Dungeon and Degrees. Our email is now fixed, as you can see by Scott being on our podcast. We are taking any requests, submissions through there. You can also add us on the Discord. I need somebody else to talk to in my Discord. So if you jump in there, it'll just be a 1v1 conversation. And we can start planning our commune up in Canada. You can also find us on Patreon. You can help support us there. I definitely still need a new laptop, so just you wait. Once all of these chips are in a row, all these ducks are in a row.
It's all over for you, nerds.
It's all over for you. And thank you to everybody we met at Gen Con. It was absolutely phenomenal and amazing. And I don't think I have enough words to express the gratitude that I'm going to assume Adrian feels, but I certainly feel. So thanks. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for listening. My name's Adrian.
And I'm Alex.
and I'm Scott.
Go have some fun.
Yay!